Hello women's writing students and welcome to your week 12 lecture pod. We're on our final text of the unit and we've only got a few more weeks to go, which is great. So we are going to be spending the next 2 weeks on an American short story called The Yellow Wallpaper, and as I've mentioned several times in my seminars, it's probably the most well-known story on the unit, and it's probably the story which has been written about more than any of the other stories that we have studied. So as I usually do when we're starting off with a new text, I'm going to jump into these slides here so that you can see them too. And I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of what we're going to look at in this pod, but also the following pod next week. So you get a sort of an overview and a bit of a sense of the conversation across both weeks for this particular text. So for week 12, which is this week, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Gothic elements in this story. It's not as obviously Gothic as some of the other stories that we've looked at, like the Gaskell, for example, which is sort of sensationalist Gothic fiction, or possibly the Mary Shelley, which again is a more obviously kind of supernatural or Gothic short story. But like some of the other stories that we've been looking at, there are elements of the Gothic in here, and I think there are quite strong elements of Gothic thinking and Gothic motifs in this story, and they play quite an important role in the story too. So for this part I'm going to focus a little bit on the Gothic, and we're also going to think a little bit about the narrative and narrative instability. And then next week in week 13, I want to pick up on women, race and madness. So this is a story whose central protagonist is considered mad in particular ways in the story, and I want us to think a little bit more about women and madness in the 19th century, and also think about the race elements in this story. When we've been looking at Tasma's story, Monsieur Coloche, and when we looked very early in the semester at the Edgeworth story, we talked a lot about race, and we talked a lot about anti-Irish sentiment in the Edgeworth story, and in Tasma's story we talked about kind of anti-European kind of sentiments working its way into that story too. And I want to think a little bit about race in this story. Again, it's much less obvious, I think, but there are sort of elements in the story. There's a kind of underlayer, kind of symbolic underlayer to the story that I want us to think about in terms of race, particularly in the American 19th century context. So next week we'll move to talking about madness and women, but also the issue of race. For now we're going to concentrate on narrative instability and the Gothic, and I'm going to start off with the narrative perspective a little bit and talk about our narrator, and also, as I do with all of the texts, give you a little bit of a sense of the background. So Gilman's story, like all the stories that we've looked at, and many short stories in the 19th century, was originally published in a magazine, the New England magazine, published in 1892. And it was published as a full story, so it wasn't serialized in the way that some of our other stories have been serialized. It's actually quite a bit shorter than many of the stories that we have been looking at. And it wasn't easy for Gilman to place this particular story. In fact, it was rejected the first time she sent it to an editor. And that editor was Horace Scudder, the Atlantic Monthly. And he said, one of the reasons that he gave for rejecting the story was that he said, "I could not forgive myself if I made others as miserable as I have made myself." So he said, "This is too much of a dark, kind of miserable story for me to want to publish in my literary magazine." And some of that deepness, that sort of deep, dark misery that he's kind of alluding to, actually comes from some personal experiences. And while, again, I don't always like to encourage students to think about the biography as somehow explaining the text, I think sometimes there are interesting contexts that's worth paying attention to. And I think in particular it's worth paying attention to some of the context and the reasons why Gilman wrote this story, because she was very public about it in ways that many of our other authors haven't been particularly public about their motivations for the story. So this little excerpt is actually included in your unit reader. It was published many years after the story in 1913, but many people asked Gilman why she wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, and so she gives some explanation to it, and much of it's based on her own experiences, and this is what she wrote. "Being naturally moved to rejoicing by this narrow escape," and when she says this narrow escape, she means her own kind of encounter with mental illness and her recovery from that, and also her rejection of a certain type of treatment in the 19th century for women who were suffering certain kinds of mental health illnesses, and were told to kind of just rest, to not work or to write or do anything, just complete bed rest. And she says I kind of escaped this. It was almost making me more mad. It was actually worsening my symptoms. So she says, being naturally moved to rejoicing by this narrow escape, I wrote the yellow wallpaper with its embellishments and additions to carry out the ideal. I never had hallucinations or objections to my mural decorations, and sent a copy to the physician who so nearly drove me mad. So this is the physician who gave her this treatment and suggested this for her. It was not intended to drive people crazy, she writes, but to save people from being driven crazy. So there is an element of the story which tries to explain or look at from a different perspective women's mental health issues, particularly women's mental health issues associated with kind of post-birth experiences, what we've now called kind of postnatal depression or postnatal psychosis. So we have kind of more medicalized terminology for this now. In the 19th century, it was often just thought of as a form of hysteria in particular ways. So she gives a bit of background, and there is a kind of level of experience. So on one hand, the story comes across as quite realistic. It's written from a first-person perspective, and it's written in a series of diary entries. But this realism as well is massively kind of undercut by the narrative instability that is built into the story. And where does some of that narrative instability come from? Well, our narrator is a nameless woman. She's infantilized in the story. She's taken care of almost as if she's a baby or a child herself. She's very dependent on her husband's sister, and friends and people that take care of her and try to help her out of her depression and her illness. She's also someone who, it's very clear, has just had a baby but cannot take care of that baby by herself, which again kind of aligns with this thinking around postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis. But during the course of the story, it's also clear that we can't always trust the narrator, because it seems that the narrator herself is undergoing some kind of psychosis, some kinds of hallucinations, that she is herself going mad. And so there is a kind of level of instability that's built into the narration. Alan Pascoe talks about this in his article Crazy Writing and Reliable Text. And he asked the question, can one give credence? Can one give validity? Can one believe someone who, beginning with a mild nervous disorder, is progressively overtaken by a more severe form of mental and behavioural disturbance or psychosis? So there is a question around the narrative stability of the text. There's a question around how far we can believe what the narrator is presenting to us, because in all sorts of ways we're inside the mind of someone who has some kind of severe mental or behavioural disturbance or psychosis. So there's a big kind of question around narrative stability. And of course, the unstable narrator is a sort of staple characteristic sometimes of Gothic texts. They also often have kind of unreliable narrations, and we've talked about this ourselves. We talked about it quite a lot in the Shelley, and we talked about it again in the Gaskell. So this is something that recurs in Gothic texts too. But what are the other kind of Gothic elements, more kind of obvious, I suppose, Gothic elements to this text? Because the Gothic elements play a particular role, I would suggest, in terms of how we read the story, how we understand the story, and how we understand the woman's kind of progressive madness in the story too. Well, some weeks ago when we were looking at some of our Gothic texts, when we were looking at the Shelley and the Gaskell, we also looked at a short video that talked a little bit about kind of English Gothic texts, and we thought about some of the different things that we see in Gothic texts, and we applied that to some of our thinking in the Shelley and also to some of our thinking in the Gaskell. And I want to just pick out 2 or 3 things that was talked about in the video, and pick up on a couple of those kind of Gothic motifs or kind of Gothic trends, and think about how they are quite evident in the story that we're looking at. First of all, the setting of the story. So the narrator makes it very clear that it's a kind of colonial mansion, she says, a hereditary estate. She would say, in her opinion, a haunted house. So right from the beginning, the setting is one which is very reminiscent of Gothic literature, kind of crumbling old hereditary mansion. And there are other kind of clues in there. She talks about the mysterious dark arbours in the garden and the different pathways. She talks about how she imagines seeing people, or sometimes does think she sees people in those passageways and pathways, but that her husband tells her, you know, she's just kind of giving way to her imagination or her fancy. So strange places, this kind of architecture that we get with the colonial mansion, the timing too, the hereditary estate. We're told that there was a problem sometime before with the heirs and the co-heirs, that the house has been abandoned for some time. So the whole setting kind of reeks of a sort of Gothic, sort of Gothic architectural setting, a Gothic sort of landscape with those mysterious pockets in the garden, the dark arbours. She talks about a certain kind of ghostliness that she feels in the house, so also alluding to a kind of supernatural. So right from the beginning of the story, we seem to be kind of in Gothic territory in particular ways. We also talked last time when we talked about the Gothic, and when we watched that video, we talked quite a bit about power. And many literary critics would see kind of power battles as a key part or a core function of Gothic texts. And we often see that playing out in terms of vulnerability on the one hand, and then on the other hand, a kind of an excessive or sometimes a kind of supernatural power. And certainly in the story, there's an imbalance of power. The woman seems particularly vulnerable. And John, her husband, seems to have an excessive amount of power over her. He restrains, or he encourages her to kind of exert a kind of self-restraint over her fancy, as he calls it, which is a sort of 19th century term for the imagination. He forbids her to write. He is a physician himself, and other physicians have told her, you know, she's not to write, she's to do this, she's not to think. And here's a short extract from the story where we get a sense of kind of John. John is practical, John the husband. John is practical in the extreme. He has no patience with faith, an intense horror of superstition, and he scoffs openly at any talk of things not to be felt and seen and put down in figures. John is a physician, and perhaps that is one of the reasons, that is one reason that I do not get well faster. So we can see there's a clear kind of imbalance of power in the story, particularly between the narrator and this kind of male figure of John the physician and the husband. Now again, because the narrative is a little bit unstable, it's always a little bit ambiguous. You know, is John this kind of monstrous figure, or is he actually some kind of husband who thinks he's kind of doing well by her or caring for her in particular ways? And even the narrator herself kind of wavers in between these two things. She will talk about John as kind of being wonderful and looking after her, and then she'll kind of make these comments like we've just seen here, where she actually thinks he might be the reason that she's not getting well faster. There's also a kind of distinction being made here, I think, in the story between practical kind of medical scientific thinking that John embodies as a physician, and the woman's own kinds of needs and desires, and they want to write and to use the imagination and to think and to be and to kind of work. And so we can kind of see there's a kind of dichotomy there as well between sort of science and the imagination that's being set up in the story. And certainly in the story, the narrator's needs and desires are figured in all sorts of ways as irrational, because they're figured as in opposition to this kind of figure of John, the physician, the man of science. So that kind of power structure is also being set up in different ways, the vulnerable woman, the powerful man, but also kind of thinking about power structures between science and the imagination, rationality and irrationality. So the story's kind of playing with that all of the time. The other thing that it's worth thinking about, particularly when it comes to the Gothic, is thinking about imprisonment and incarceration. This was something that we looked at quite a bit in some of our other stories, and most of those other stories did have kind of plot lines which often kind of followed a female protagonist that felt or was physically kind of imprisoned or entrapped in some way, or incarcerated, whether it was in a sort of a house or some other kind of domestic setting. So those kind of feelings of imprisonment. And it's worth noting some of the kind of imagery that comes about when the narrator describes her surroundings in the house. She's in the attic room at the top of the house. She says at first, I wanted to be downstairs, but I was told that we had to go upstairs, and she's kind of put into this room. She says it was a nursery first and then a playroom and a gymnasium. I should judge, for the windows are barred for little children, and there are rings and things in the wall. And so there's a couple of things that seem to be going on there. First of all, the idea that it was a nursery and a playroom and a gymnasium is just her perception. I should judge. I think that that's what they must have been, because there's bars on the window and there are rings and things in the wall. What else could it possibly have been used for? But there's also kind of images here of imprisonment. The idea, again, of, you know, John the physician and his kind of scientific diagnosis of his wife, his kind of medical diagnosis, and this idea that she must rest and she must be put to rest, she must be stopped from thinking and working and writing because that's making everything else worse, even though she herself perceives that actually perhaps it's being barred from those things that are making it worse for her. And so there is a sense that the nursery somehow is suspicious. There is a sense that somehow it's acting as some kind of prison for the woman, and not necessarily that it used to be a nursery. The rings and things in the wall, what were they, or what are they being used for? Is she tied down at certain points? The bed is nailed into the floor. And so there are things here that raise our suspicions, and certainly there's a sense of a woman who is entrapped, not just physically, but also perhaps kind of mentally in particular ways, and certainly socially. So again, there's a kind of ambiguity over the nursery. Is it just an innocent nursery, or is it something else? The last point I wanted to make was about kind of Gothic doublings and twinnings. So often in Gothic literature, we find what we would think of as doubles or twins. And in this story, I think we have a similar thing with the narrator and the figure, the other woman that she sees in the wallpaper, who also is kind of behind bars. You know, the shadowing of the bars in the nursery then make this figure look as if she also is behind bars. And there's an idea that this figure is the woman in some ways, that it is actually some part of the woman, it is some othered part of her. And we'll think more in class about what that woman or who that woman represents. But certainly there is a kind of Gothicism to that, this idea of a kind of a double, a sort of female double here, and what does that female double represent? So there's the narrator and the woman in the wallpaper. But it's also worth noting, many literary critics have pointed out that the story is very reminiscent of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, which is a 19th century novel published much earlier than the story in 1847. And you have the central protagonist, Jane, and then you have this more mysterious figure, Bertha Mason. Bertha Mason is the wife, the first wife of Mr. Rochester, and of course Jane and Mr. Rochester want to be married, and she's the sort of barrier to some of that. But Bertha Mason in Jane Eyre is also a mad woman who is incarcerated and locked in an attic, and tied down also in that attic. So there's a funny kind of doubling here as well. There's a kind of internal doubling within the story, but the story also seems to be doubling up with other literary characters, and one of those characters seems to be Bertha Mason, this kind of mad woman in the attic figure from Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. And again, we might want to think about how does that open up the story to different kinds of interpretation when there's this kind of obvious paralleling with someone like Bertha Mason from another 19th century story. So that's just some of the ways of thinking about this story as Gothic. It's it's one way of kind of beginning to feel our way through the story and get a sense of what is going on. So that's it for this week and for this lecture pod, and I'll enjoy chatting with students in class about the story later next week.